I want to talk about data visualization. This project kind of began on trying to think through what role libraries played in kind of local community resilience for lots of reasons, but also because of their ability to be brokers for knowledge about information literacy, or how to help people navigate information, right? To use a term that I think has been brought up this morning and is really handy. But the ability to interview folks and observe libraries did not really go well given certain situations, and this COVID stuff started to come up and it was very interesting. At the end of February, The Economist published an article that used a chart that's similar to the one that you see here. Actually, this is just adapted from The Economist. This is just in the watermark of the slide. And it's the idea of flatten the curve, which is pretty ubiquitous right now, but it's this idea that we have a curve of cases and we have a threshold here of our health system capacity. And if we flatten the curve of cases through different kinds of activity, then we might not overwhelm the healthcare system. And so this chart became not a meme, but became a trope and a way for people to think through how to adapt and mitigate the impact of this. And I have been joking, right, that this is one of the, I don't know if there's ever been a movement around public health or anything that uses a statistical data visualization as its flag. And so it seems like there's some interesting stuff going on here about circulating charts and graphs. Predictive models have become kind of in the forefront of many people's conversations about how all of this is going to go. So that is the kind of beginning of why this is interesting to me. I have two different things that I want to show up here. One looks like a mess. This is a sample of people who are on Twitter, and all these links are different Twitter accounts retweeting one another. So you can see there is a ton of overlap right now across this entire conversation. These are people who are tweeting about this idea of a plandemic. So this is a disinformation video that was released at the beginning of May. You'll see there's a ton of different overlaps among all these color-coded modules, right? So an algorithm has kind of shaded in these different subgroups so we can see communities, if you will, using that term rather loosely, of people who are kind of tend to be tweeting at one another. And you see there's actually like a pretty reasonable amount of overlap. And you can really appreciate that when you compare it to this. These are people tweeting about flatten the curve. So this is one of maybe 100 different samples of 25,000 tweets that I've been taking over the last few months. And so we've got at least over 1 million tweets for sure in this one sample that we're using, and then over 10 million tweets in another sample that we might get to at some point. But what you can see is that a lot of these groups are a lot more distinct than what we saw here. And I'm just going to flip between them so you can appreciate it. A lot of what you see is actually people distributing information locally. So different governor's offices. This is Greta Thunberg up here. We could drive around this model if we had a little bit more time. I'd be happy to show folks if they're interested later on. But anyway, you can see that this is a lot more modular, right? So the way I've been kind of talking about this is a bunch of eggs that are all in their carton. And they're all in the same carton. They're all talking about the same thing, but they're all in their own little slot, just like a dozen eggs. Whereas this is more like an omelet, where you've got a lot of people kind of overlapping in these conversations. This is characteristic of the way that misinformation has been observed to spread, that human beings start to resemble bots in the way that they distribute information. Well, why is this important for us here? Well, flatten the curve is this interesting idea that where everybody who at least was initially using this hashtag has this kind of commitment to empiricism. Now, what I mean by that is they have some kind of commitment to evidence, to models, to statistics or math, to public health officials. This is something that we don't see in people who are endorsing conspiracy theories. And so this flatten the curve data visualizations and charts, right? I'm choosing to use the flatten the curve hashtag as a way to start sampling the use of charts and graphs. And so I bring up the differences in sharing practices between misinformative and more empiricist circles because it is the nature of the sample of the charts that we'll be examining right now, is that most of the charts we'll be looking at will be about people trying to get at some kind of fact-based sense of shared reality. Now, that's not to say that we're not doing other work on misinformation outside of the auspices of Kerr, but for Kerr, I'm specifically interested in people who are trying to make a difference. What are their habits? What are their practices? What are their successes? What are their confounds? And so I'm thinking about resilience in terms of verbs here, right? Anticipating resilience can be thought of as anticipating, sensing, adapting, learning, and then I've added a verb here, narrating. The stories we tell about that information help us transfer to the next situation, and visualizations kind of sit in the middle of how we formulate these narratives. And so I just want to compare two different charts here, right, just as a case in point, about why it's important to look at charts of COVID-19 or how we look at the pandemic, right? So here's a New York Times graphic, which is known as a graduated symbol plot. And this has received a lot of criticism as occluding more data than it's showing and making it more difficult to understand. Also, the color scheme kind of plays with your emotions at times. So this is, but be that as it may, judgment aside, this is one popular way that people are seeing the pandemic in the United States. Here's an alternative graphic using small multiples from Reuters, where every single trend for every single state is a spark line. So, I would contend that the one on the right is more data rich and more helpful than the one on the left. But I'm interested in what is the circulation of the one on the left? What is the circulation of the one on the right? What are people saying about either one? What other charts and graphs are out there that are helping people make sense of this? This is a really complex phenomenon. The models and other kinds of systems that we're using and communicating to the public are not straightforward. So the problem is that, resilience actors, which I have kind of outlined here, need to understand the tendencies and impacts of charting. So visuals are coming to the forefront. We need to understand their activity. So similar to what Katie mentioned, where I'm not really testing a hypothesis here, I'm trying to develop a theory. I'm trying to develop a better understanding of what the role of charts and graphs has been. So here's another example, right? It's a kind of recent study of trying to understand the difference between a log scale and a linear scale of the data. And the people who used the log scale, or who looked at the log scale in this study, were like 40% more likely to think that the pandemic wasn't a big deal compared to the ones who look at the linear scale and see this move up. And so this is an instance of the curve flattening, right? We trying to make sense of what curve are we flattening? Are we flattening the curve on the log scale, on a linear scale? Does anybody know the difference, et cetera? So complicated environment, trying to understand, again, what charts are doing what kind of work. So what characterizes the online visual ecology of the outbreak as it pertains to charts and graphs about COVID-19 is the research question that we're doing. So our procedure is going to be twofold. On the one hand, we are going to extract graphics from all the tweets that we've collected. So Twitter has metadata that points us to graphics that are posted. So we can collect all those images and put them in a bucket and then do some machine learning on them to understand what are some of the tendencies or categories that exist in all of these images, right? So we can subset out charts and graphs and then look at all the different variety in charts and graphs. So, and then at the same time, measure the circulation of certain types of charts and graphs by looking at their retweet rate and kind of how far they move across different networks over time. The other thing that we're going to do is actually examine charts and graphs manually from major outlets, from state governments and newspapers, to try to see what their use of charts and graphs has been. And that's really to develop a human theory-driven taxonomy of these different kinds of charts that are out there. And so we have kind of two passes. One is a manual inspection qualitative evaluation, and one is a 10,000-foot view quantitative evaluation. So the things that we plan to do, there's a special issue of the International Communication Association journal that's due in June. That's all about memes or other kinds of online trends, and Flatten the Curve fits kind of perfectly in that. So we'll be submitting an abstract for that. We plan to release our data set of images and Twitter IDs. Twitter doesn't like it if you share all of the tweets in their full form. So we can share all of their IDs that we've collected over time. And then an online publication that tries to provide some observations and lessons learned about visualizing something complex like the COVID-19 outbreak. There's there's some best practices webinars out there, but none of them are leverage the kind of full force of the scope that we're trying to get at here. So here are just some other examples. I'm not sure how much time I have left.
You got a couple minutes?
Couple minutes. So here's an example of of how a graphic, we would want to tag and trace this graphic. This is actually put out by our own government, where they're fitting a certain statistical curve with this red line here, to really mislead people about the cases are going to drop, right? That's the indication. When in fact a predictive model that people trust tends to show that that's not the case. Little details here and there about what makes up a chart can really impact people's perception, right? So Georgia is another example, right? People were really supportive of Georgia as they were reopening. They published this chart at the end of last week, and you can see that the cases are going down. So this is one of those charts that's not going to get caught by an AI system that we're putting together, but it will be caught by a human being. You'll notice that it looks like the cases are going down in Georgia, but you'll also notice that they've changed the order of all of the counties in each time bucket, and that the time buckets aren't even in order. I think there is a non-malevolent justification for why this chart exists that I can kind of go into later. But the main idea is that charts are everywhere. They're being used as evidence, not just demonstration, because these models are too complex for people to understand. So the charts become the proof. And so they become very consequential. And our sense or our actions and our resilience depends on these charts actually being reliable. So I won't read out all of these things together, but I'll just kind of wrap up by saying that, that understanding these charts also helps us understand this concept of the curve. And the curve is more than just a plot on a particular chart. The curve seems to be borrowed and used for other things, right? Greta Thunberg now being one of the biggest actors on the flatten the curve, because climate activists are now starting to think more and more about the climate curve. And so curves being thought of as a collective goal, as something that is understood through models and evidence. So how we understand curves and what place evidence or charts have in trying to help people feel enfranchised in that curve or alienated by that curve feels like consequential research when thinking about collective activity or future adaptation to really complex crises and challenges. And so my acknowledgements, the CUR team has been awesome. Never really been part of something that really supports ideation so much and is really kind of open about the fact that people change their mind. Really awesome conversations with folks. I have a really terrible memory, but every person here, I've just had a really cool moment talking with you. That's been really helpful to me, and I'm greatly appreciative of it. And also ASU Library for their support of this work as well. So thank you so much. That's the end of what I've got for everyone today.
Thank you, Michael. I loved all the visuals. Okay. Have at it, everyone. I don't see anything. People are all busy watching and not typing some questions. So
I have a comment, and I don't know if this is totally helpful, but I love this study, Michael. I think I mentioned before, I think it's super interesting and super important, like the ethics of charts at this time, because they're distilling this really complicated information. I just really like how you're putting this together. I keep thinking of this one paper that I like by Michel Calonne called An Essay on Framing and Overflowing. And I feel like there's maybe something interesting there about how, he basically talks about how we have these different frames for situations, and they can be hot frames that are highly contested or cold frames that are widely accepted. And that then when things overflow the frame, they're not accounted for in the main frame. I realize I'm being very abstract, but I feel like there's something interesting about how the charts are framing our understanding of COVID, and then there are things that are not accounted for in those charts, and therefore kind of fall away from notice. And that might be an interesting.
That is so awesome. Thank you. I'm as you know, right, I'm working with Latour and some very formal thinking through the different highly formal chunks of the visualizations, even down to the JavaScript libraries that they all share, right? So thinking through some of this other theory, and that's just awesome feedback. I appreciate it.
Well, I put the citation in the chat.
Great.
Michael, I have a question. I think this is really very fascinating, like everybody else. I wonder, like, how do you determine, like, at some point you were talking sort of like, okay, well, there's clearly some people who are driven more by empirical, like, how do you, like, so like you have like propaganda and then you have like empirical data, like there's a spectrum, but like, how do you, like, who makes that determination? Like, and I understand it's not, like, I know that there's, you can probably objectively say this, but I mean, I judge things in a particular way because I have a particular lens and I don't try to be objective, or like I realize I'm not objective. So I was wondering, like, how do you do that?
Well, so that's an awesome question. I think for our project, we're not trying to say one is misinformation and one is not. And I think that's why our sample is on the hashtag rather than any other method of collection, right? So we do have other data where we're just looking for keywords and it's like a really broad sample. But for this, it's a little bit more targeted. Anybody who bothers to hashtag sorry, I've been swimming in the sewer of like conspiracy theory Twitter, so I have pandemic on the brain. But like, that's a really dark world. But flatten the curve is one of those things where, yes, there are people who are not in agreement. There are people who are acting there who are promoting conspiracy theories, but it's the people who, like, the hashtag began in this one way. And so I almost think about it like genetically rather than anything else. So like, they're all descendants of that one flatten the curve conversation, and they all choose to hashtag it in that way. Trying to figure out which one is misinformation and which is not isn't the project of, isn't this project right now. We will be able to find out if people freaked out when one chart got posted or when one didn't, or if one got lit up or one didn't. If we're lucky, right, we'll be able to get that signal. But yeah, we're not, I think in general, the sharing practices, and this is what other folks have been able to observe, the sharing practices of conspiracy theorists tends to resemble bots in that they share very quickly. And so while you have a lot of high profile folks sharing this stuff out and that helps signal boost, you have human beings rapidly sharing before they even read it. They're, just as a quick aside, right? A lot of times when folks share stuff on social media, they're interested in sharing information that they believe to be true. When people who are like more on the conspiracy theory side of reasoning, and right, and people have kind of charted these as two different ways of knowing, they're interested in being validated socially. So they share it and somebody gives it a like, that helps them feel like it's true or that it's worth talking about, which is very different from saying, I want to fact check and go through this evidence. And right, so we've got all these people fact checking. Fact checking doesn't matter. All they want is like 20, 30 likes and they feel validated rather than validated, right? Like a scientist might think about validation. Anyway, so that's the long and short of that.